welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The impossible crime. It is an old and perhaps rather sentimental habit of mine to keep the window of our Baker Street sitting room slightly ajar during the first days of spring. The fresh air, thin, though it might be over the soot-thickened rooftops of London, has a clarifying effect on my thoughts, especially when contrasted with the sharp fumes of Holmes' ever-present tobacco. And it was precisely on such a brisk April morning that Inspector Lestrade arrived, his expression as tightly wound as the knot in his cravat. Holmes was draped across the settee like a marionette, whose strings had been severed, the Times spread across his chest, and a curl of smoke from his pipe trailing toward the ceiling, like a question mark yet to be answered. He did not rise as Lestrade entered, merely shifted the paper aside and said, "Judging by your gait on the stairs, Inspector, I deduce this is not a social call." Lestrade's coat dusted with white flecks, and his gloves still on, gave a stiff nod. "A murder. Quite unlike anything I've seen." Holmes gestured languidly. "Sit, then. Enlighten us." The inspector remained standing. "You know the Glastons, the Viscount and Viscountess of Windermere, a scandalous little peeress, she with a penchant for absinthe, and he with a passion for scandal." "Correct. They were entertaining guests at their country estate this weekend. A private gathering of 6 old money, politicians, a Russian pianist, that sort." Holmes tapped ash into a silver tray, "And one of them wound up dead." Lestrade nodded. "Yes, killed in a locked conservatory with no apparent weapon. The body was found this morning, but what puzzles everyone isn't the method or the guests." He paused for emphasis. "It's the note left behind." Holmes' eyes flicked open with interest. Lestrade continued. "Folded on the dead man's chest was a paper swan origami. Its beak was soaked in blood, just a few drops, but the beak had been cut with such precision that the blood had not spilled or stained the body. It appeared ... placed." "A swan," Holmes murmured. "How poetic. Was it made from ordinary paper?" Lestrade shook his head. "That's the other thing. The paper wasn't English. Japanese, from what the forensics boys say. Hand-pressed, silk-infused, rare, and expensive. Probably imported directly." Holmes sat up now, his interest piqued. "And the victim, a man named Harold Greeley, American banker, wealthy, but not the type to inspire hatred, by all accounts." Watson, whose instincts for ordinary vice were keener than mine, leaned forward, "And the room was locked." From the inside, Lestrade confirmed, only one entrance. No broken windows, no hidden passage, no sign of struggle either. It was as if the man simply lay down and died. "And yet a swan with blood on its beak does not fold itself," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Lestrade hesitated. "There's one more thing. The estate's gardener says he saw Greeley at dawn, walking toward the conservatory, alone, calm, as if he meant to meet someone, or something." Holmes murmured. "But no one else entered," Lestrade insisted. "There were guards, grounds are walled. It's impossible." "Impossible," Holmes echoed with a hint of glee. "An ideal way to begin the day." Watson glanced at Holmes. "You intend to go to Win—" "Of course," Holmes replied, standing and brushing a stray ash from his sleeve. "A man is found dead in a locked room, with a bloodied origami swan placed neatly upon his chest-stand. You expect me to remain in London?" He turned to Lestrade with the faintest flicker of a smile. "Have them prepare the room, Inspector. Dr. Watson and I will be there before the afternoon shadows stretch too long." Chapter 2. The summons to Windermere. Is one of the peculiar privileges of my long association with Sherlock Holmes that I have witnessed the vast gulf between public perception and private reality. To the world, Holmes was a calculating machine, cold, clinical, and utterly detached. But I, who have seen him at his most human and most haunted, can attest that it was precisely the strangest, most impossible cases which breathed life into him. By noon that same day, we were en route to Windermere Estate in Surrey, the skies above us a wet slate of grey, and the countryside rushing past the windows of our hired carriage. Holmes, as ever, travelled with minimal luggage, His only true companions were a well-worn notebook and a half-empty tin of tobacco. Lestrade, seated opposite us, kept fidgeting with his gloves and casting anxious glances at the fields beyond. It was clear he found the entire affair deeply unsettling. "Tell me again," Holmes said, barely glancing up from his notes. "You're certain the conservatory door was locked from the inside?" "As certain as one can be," Lestrade replied. "The room has a single entrance, and it locks with a key from the inside. The butler had to fetch a groundsman with a crowbar to break the door open after the gardener reported seeing something through the glass. No key was found. None. And what's more, there's no indication the lock was tampered with. For all appearances, Mr. Greeley locked himself in. Yet he did not leave," Holmes said thoughtfully. "And the windows, all latched. No signs of forced entry. Not a footprint outside on the conservatory path. And the floor within was swept clean save for the Swan. Of course." Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. "A man found alone in a locked room. A foreign object placed deliberately on his chest. Blood, but no wound reported." Lestrade gave a helpless shrug. "We're waiting on the post-mortem. But there was no visible trauma, no gunshot, no knife wound. If not for the gardener's report and the paper Swan, one might think he'd simply fallen asleep." Holmes murmured something too low to catch, then opened his eyes sharply. "And the other guests? Who are they?" Lestrade pulled a folded list from his breast pocket. "Aside from Lord and Lady Windermere, there's Colonel Percival, Staunton retired military, lives in Cornwall. Lady Agnes Howarth, a widowed philanthropist. Mikhail Petrov, the Russian pianist well known in London circles. And a Miss Clara Vellum, governess to the Viscount's niece." Holmes's brow arched. "Governesses at country estates do not often dine with bankers, colonels, and aristocrats." "I thought the same," Lestrade admitted, but Lady Windermere insisted she be included. "The niece is unwell, confined to her room, some kind of fever. Miss Vellum was allowed to attend dinner in her place." "Curious," Holmes murmured. We soon turned off the main road and began our slow ascent up the long gravel drive of Windermere Estate. The manor loomed at the top of a modest hill of Victorian monstrosity, of pale stone and angular gables. The sort of house that seemed forever bathed in overcast light. Despite the springtime, the gardens were unkempt, the hedgerows sagging with neglect. As the carriage rolled to a stop, a liveried footman emerged from the entrance and opened the door with stiff precision. Lestrade climbed out first, followed by Holmes. I stepped onto the drive and was immediately struck by the unnatural quiet that surrounded the estate. No birdsong, no wind, just a heavy, suspended hushaz, though the house itself were holding its breath. We were shown into the drawing room by the butler, a tall skeletal man named Merrick, whose black attire and silent manner made him seem more mourner than servant. "Lord and Lady Windermere will be down shortly," he said in a tone that brooked no conversation. "Miss Vellum is in the music room. Colonel Staunton has gone out to ride. The rest are in their rooms." As Merrick left us, Holmes wandered to the fireplace and stared at the row of porcelain figurines along the mantel, a collection of tiny animals, all in white, arranged by size. "Watson," he said quietly, "tell me what strikes you first about this room." I glanced around. Heavy velvet drapes hung limp across the windows. A Persian rug covered the floor, and a portrait of Lord Windermere, in ceremonial dress, dominated the far wall. Nothing out of the ordinary, save perhaps a lingering trace of pipe smoke. "The air seems musty," I said at last. Holmes nodded. "And yet it is not the season for closed windows. That, too, is a choice." Before I could question him further, the door opened and Lady Windermere swept in, all black lace and widow's elegance, though her husband lived and breathed. She was pale and striking, with large dark eyes that did not blink often. Her hands trembled, despite her efforts to keep them clasped. "I appreciate your coming," she said without preamble, "though I cannot say I welcome the intrusion." Holmes bowed politely. "Intrusions are rather my specialty, Lady Win. I understand you hosted Mr. Greeley this past weekend." Her eyes flicked toward Lestrade, then back to Holmes. "Yes, he was a friend of my husband's. They'd done business together in New York years ago." "Did he appear anxious? Distracted?" She hesitated. "He was, quiet, more so than usual. He and Mikhail had a disagreement, I believe, over some absurd topic, musical technique, or trade tariffs. I wasn't listening." "And did he mention receiving anything? A letter, a gift?" Now she looked puzzled. "No. Why do you ask?" Holmes gave a non-committal shrug. "Idle curiosity." At that moment, a door somewhere down the hall slammed, and heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. A voice barked. "If you ask me, the man drank himself to death." Colonel Staunton, Lestrade muttered. Holmes turned to me, eyes glinting. Come, Watson. I believe it's time we viewed the conservatory. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. The conservatory of Windmere Estate stood at the far end of the eastern wing, a glass and iron appendage that jutted from the manor like a forgotten thought. As we approached, I noted that the air seemed colder here, the light flatter, as though some trace of the crime still lingered, too subtle for the eyes, but not for the nerves. Holmes walked ahead of us, hands laced behind his back, every movement deliberate. Lestrade followed with visible discomfort, muttering under his breath about drafts and damp stonework. I trailed behind them both, notebook at the ready, though I was far more accustomed to jotting down observations after the fact than during Holmes' investigative ballet. The double doors to the conservatory had been left slightly ajar. Holmes pushed them open with a single finger. The room beyond was silent. Morning light filtered through the stained glass overhead, casting pale pink and green patterns across the tile floor. It was a cathedral of exotic plants, ferns, orchids, and tall, spindly palms, all arranged in terracotta pots and iron troughs along the walls and central path. At the far end, beneath a climbing wall of ivy, stood a wrought iron chaise lounge, and upon it, the scene of the mystery. The blood had been cleaned at least in part, but the space still bore the aura of recent death. The chaise itself was bare now, save for a white linen sheet folded neatly atop it. Holmes paused beside it, eyes sweeping the area with rapt attention. The gardener found the body here, he asked. Lestrade nodded. Just as you see it. Greeley was lying on his back. No signs of struggle, as I said, arms at his sides. The paper Swan was on his chest directly over the heart. Holmes crouched beside the lounge and peered at the tile floor. He pulled a small magnifying lens from his waistcoat pocket and inspected a faint scuff just beneath. The leg of the chaise moved, he said quietly. Slightly, but moved. Someone shifted the chair after the body was discovered, or perhaps just before he stood and began pacing the perimeter of the room. I observed his eyes darting to minute details: a disturbed fern, the angle of sunlight on the floor, a faint line of condensation along one of the window panes. Look here, Watson, he called. Dot. I joined him near the entrance. Holmes pointed to a footprint, barely visible in the dust, an arrow shape with a pointed toe. Smaller than my own. Woman's shoe, he said. Recent. The heel didn't fully press into the tile. She was walking lightly, nervously. Perhaps. Lestrade leaned in. One of the guests. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He moved to the far corner of the room where a small table stood. On it was a watering can, a pair of shears, and several scraps of paper discarded, torn, and crumpled. Holmes picked one up and unfolded it carefully. It was a triangle of thick paper, folded once at the corner. The fibers had been creased, but not completed, an unfinished origami fold. He held it up to the light. Japanese washi, same as the Swan. Lestrade nodded. The lab confirmed it. Holmes smiled faintly. So our killer practices their art nearby. Comfortable here. Familiar. He continued his slow circuit of the conservatory, pausing now and then to examine a pot, tap the floor, or run his finger along a window frame. At one point he stopped dead and crouched again. There's something in the soil, he murmured. He dipped his fingers into the earth of a fern pot and withdrew a sliver of pale ribbon, barely an inch long, frayed at one edge. A thread? I asked. No, not a thread. Satin, I believe, from a garment, something torn, not part of the crime scene by accident, I should think. He tucked the fragment into his notebook, eyes alight with quiet intensity. Lestrade rubbed his temples. It still makes no sense. No one entered the room. No one left. The paper Swan, the blood, it's theatrical. A message, maybe. Holmes didn't respond. He stepped back to the center of the room and slowly turned in place, eyes closed. It's too neat, he said finally. Too intentional. Every element here was arranged, not just executed. This isn't a spontaneous crime, it's a performance. A performance for whom? I asked. For us, Holmes said. Or rather, for someone they expected would understand it. Someone the victim trusted enough to meet in a locked room. Someone who could place this one delectably, deliberately, without haste or fear. The silence that followed was heavy. Holmes opened his eyes and walked to the glass door that led out into the garden path. He examined the lock. Undisturbed, no tampering. And yet, there are smudges here, faint, as if someone tried to wipe them after closing the door. Lestrade frowned. But the gardener said Greeley entered through the main door. He did, Holmes replied. But perhaps someone else left this way. Someone who knew the path well and took care not to be seen. But that's impossible, Lestrade objected. The door locks from the inside. If they left that way, They couldn't have locked it behind them. Unless, Holmes said, they never locked it at all. I stared at him. You mean the door wasn't locked? Holmes shook his head. No, it was locked when the butler broke it open, but perhaps not by the killer. Perhaps by someone else. Someone who found the body and panicked, or someone who wanted to preserve the scene. He turned back to the room, eyes scanning every detail once more. We must speak to the staff, he said, not just the guests. Someone has a key. Someone knew Mr. Greeley's movements, and someone, I fear, is playing a longer game than we yet understand. He paused, then added, and I'd like to meet Miss Clara Vellum. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Often remarked that the most telling moment in any investigation was not when evidence was discovered, but when the players, unaware of the script, stepped onto the stage. It was, he said, the rawest moment, the fragile time before masks were perfected by early evening. The drawing room of Windermere Manor had transformed into such a stage. The sunlight had begun its descent behind the hills, casting long gold bars across the rug as Holmes, Lestrade, and I took our places. The suspects entered one by one, each cloaked in their own armor, some others theatrical. The first to arrive was Colonel Percival Staunton, a square-jawed man with a sun-darkened face and a stiff gait that spoke of old injuries. He smelled faintly of horses and tobacco. He took a seat near the fireplace and lit a short briar pipe without asking permission, which told me all I needed to know of his temperament. Damn shame about Greeley, he said. Not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Odd fellow, but didn't deserve that. Next came Lady Agnes Howe, a woman of indeterminate age, whose reputation as a benefactor of charities did little to soften the cold, eagle-eyed scrutiny with which she regarded the room. She wore mourning colors, though I couldn't say for who manned a brooch of carved jet at her throat. Such ghastly business, she murmured as she sat. But that's what comes of mingling with Americans. No sense of discretion. Behind her, moving like a whisper, entered Miss Clara Vellum. I had imagined someone prim, perhaps severe, but Miss Vellum was neither. She was young, no more than 25, with a calm, watchful face and eyes, the color of ash before rain. Her dress was simple but elegant, a modest ribbon tucked at the waist. She nodded to the room and sat near the window, hands folded neatly in her lap. Holmes's gaze lingered on her for only a moment, before returning to the door. The last to arrive was Mikhail Petrov, the Russian pianist. He was a slight man, olive-skinned, with long fingers that never stopped moving, tapping against his knee, twisting the silver ring on his index finger, flicking a crumb from his cuff. His dark eyes scanned the room with theatrical flair. No wine? He asked, eyebrows raised. A tragedy indeed. Holmes rose. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, thank you for joining us. We shall be brief. I ask only for patience and honesty. You were all present at Windermere on the night Mr. Harold Greeley died. My aim is not accusation, but clarity. The colonel snorted. I told Lestrade everything. Greeley went to the conservatory before dawn. I heard him leave. I'm a light sleeper. You heard him leave his room? Holmes asked. Yes. Creaky floors in this place woke me up. Did you hear anyone else? Staunton hesitated. No. And I stayed awake after that. Lit a pipe. I'd have noticed. Holmes nodded. Lady Ham? She pursed her lips. I retired early. I take a tonic for sleep. I didn't hear a thing until the butler raised the alarm. Frankly, I thought it all a misunderstanding. Mr. Greeley was a peculiar man. Holmes asked. She shrugged. Always watching. He had questions, far too many for a guest. Holmes turned to Petrov. You argued with him? The pianist smiled faintly. Oh yes, over and politics. And women, I think. But we argued often. It meant nothing. We drank brandy after. I found him a touch dull. And where were you at dawn? In bed, Petrov said, with a headache, I admit. Anyone to confirm that? He spread his hands. Alas. No, I sleep alone. Holmes shifted his attention. Miss Vellum, you were invited to supper, despite being staff. Her expression did not change. Yes, her ladyship insisted. I was reluctant, but it would have been rude to refuse. You dined with Mr. Greeley? Yes. We spoke briefly. He asked about my travels. He seemed curious that a governess had been to Japan. Japan, Holmes repeated. Her eyes met his. Yes. I lived in Kyoto for a year, with a merchant family. Their daughter was my first pupil. Holmes tilted his head. And origami. She gave a faint smile. Is taught to children. I learned the basic folds. Yes. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Do you recognize this? He reached into his coat and removed the partial paper fold retrieved from the conservatory. Miss Vellum examined it. The beginning of a crane, she said calmly, or a swan, depending on how it's finished. Holmes returned it to his pocket. Did you notice anything strange that night? He asked her. Miss Vellum hesitated, then said, Mr. Greeley seemed distracted. He asked me about paper, what kind was best for folding, and where to find it. I thought it a passing interest. Did you tell him? I mentioned the washi used in Kyoto. I had a few sheets. I gave him one. A pause fell over the room like a shroud. Did anyone see Mr. Greeley after supper? Holmes asked the group. No one spoke. Holmes nodded. Very well. You may go, except for Miss Vellum. I'd like a word. The others filed out. The colonel muttered something about nonsense. Petrov hummed a bar of a Chopin nocturne. Lady Howarth left without a glance backward. Holmes waited until the door shut. Miss Vellum, he said quietly, why did you give him the washi paper? She looked at him evenly. He asked for it, and I was curious. Curious. Her voice softened. He didn't want to fold a crane or a flower. He wanted something, precise. A swan with its wings folded tightly, beak downward. He said it was symbolic. Symbolic of what? Miss Vellum looked away. He didn't say. Holmes nodded slowly. That will be all, Miss Vellum, but I may have further questions. She stood, gave a slight bow, and left. When she was gone, I turned to Holmes. You suspect her? I suspect everyone, he said, but someone in that room was lying. And tomorrow, we visit the servants' quarters. I want to know who else had access to that paper. Chapter 5. First suspects, the red herring. It was just past 8 the following morning when Holmes and I descended to the servants' wing of Windermere Manor. A fine mist clung to the windows, blurring the edges of the world beyond, while the corridors within felt unusually silent, too silent. In Holmes' estimation, we were greeted in the kitchen by a young scullery maid, who blushed violently at Holmes' polite nod, before disappearing into the pantry. At the long oak table sat Mr. Merrick, the evergrim butler, along with the cook, a broad woman with flour on her sleeves, and Jacob Long, the head groundsman, his hands rough as tree bark and his boots leaving faint traces of soil across the stone floor. We appreciate your time, Holmes said cordially, drawing no small measure of suspicion with his civility. Merrick folded his gloved hands. We've already spoken to the inspector. Indeed, Holmes replied. But I find that, in complex matters, repetition reveals detail. Long grunted. Greeley was found dead in a locked room. We didn't kill him. Holmes' smile was thin. You would be amazed how often the obvious suspect is also the wrong one. That is why I don't believe you did. This seemed to disarm them. Even Merrick eased somewhat, though his voice remained level. What is it you wish to know? Holmes took a seat opposite. A guest was murdered in the conservatory. The killer left behind a folded paper swan, crafted from expensive Japanese washi. Now, this type of paper is rare. Lady Windermere does not keep such a thing in the library. Yet it was here, and not just in the conservatory. We found scraps of it in a potting tray. I need to know who else has handled it, who touched it, who admired it, and most importantly, who gave it to Mr. Greeley. A silence followed. Heavy and unwelcoming. It was the cook who finally spoke. Miss Vellum had a roll of it, kept it in her room, I think. She gave a few sheets to the little girl, told her it was special. Holmes raised a brow. Lady Windermere's niece. Aye. Poor thing's got some wasting sickness. Barely speaks. But she'd sit for hours, folding those little birds with Miss Vellum. Left M everywhere, on the banister, windowsills. Even in the dumbwaiter once. Merrick gave a disapproving sniff. Hardly proper. Was Mr. Greeley aware of this hobby? Holmes asked. Jacob Long shifted in his seat. Saw him watching her, once. The girl, last week, stood at the top of the stairs, like he'd wandered into a memory. When I passed, he asked what the paper was. Said it reminded him of something unfinished. I didn't ask. Holmes gave a faint hum, as though some chord had been struck in his mind. Who had access to the conservatory key? He asked. Just me, said Merrick. It hangs in the whole cabinet. Locked. I unlock it each morning to water the plants and open the vents. Was it locked the night of the murder? Merrick hesitated. It should have been. That's not what I asked. No, the butler admitted. It was not. Lord Windermere asked me to leave it available in case the guests wanted to smoke in the conservatory. It's not uncommon. Holmes turned to Long. Did you see anything unusual the morning Mr. Greeley died? Long nodded. Just past dawn. I saw him walking out to the conservatory. Had a folded bit of paper in his hand square, like the kind the girl plays with. I waved, but he didn't respond. And afterward, I came back round 20 minutes later. I saw something through the glass. Him on the lounge. I knocked. Nothing. I thought he was sleeping. But then I saw the blood on the bird. Then you alerted Merrick. And he fetched Lestrade. Holmes stood. Thank you. One more thing, was anyone unusually interested in the girl's origami? The cook nodded. The pianist, Mr. Petrov. He always praised the folds. Said they reminded him of something from his youth. He took one once, stuffed it into his coat like a souvenir. Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. He left the kitchen without another word, and I followed him down the corridor, past portraits that watched with wooden indifference. You suspect I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. In every performance, he said at last, there is someone who plays to the crowd, and someone who plays to the silence. And Petrov is the former. Quite, he flirts with shadows and indulges in theatrics. But his interest in the origami, it may be sincere, or it may be a mask. We returned to the drawing room to find Lestrade reading a sheaf of notes with furrowed brows. News, he said. The postmortem's come through. Holmes took the report, scanned it, and whistled low. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Lestrade read aloud. But with traces of a rare neurotoxin in the bloodstream, derived from a species of tree frog phyllobates, found only in South America. A poison, Holmes murmured. Fast, absorbed through the skin. Lestrade frowned. No wounds. No injection point. Holmes looked up. It was on the paper. You're serious? Very. If the killer applied it to the folds of the Swan, or even to the surface of the washi, Greeley could have absorbed a lethal dose just by touching it, especially if he was folding it himself. Lestrade exhaled. So the paper was the weapon. Holmes nodded, almost to himself. And the question becomes, not merely who gave him the paper, but why they knew it would kill him. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. Holmes once told me that a man can make 1,000 statements, but it is the one thing he does not say, the gap. The inconsistency, the silence, that often gives him away. It was precisely such a silence that lingered in Holmes' thoughts as we returned to our quarters that evening. He paced the room with quiet deliberation, pipe clamped between his teeth, the ember within glowing steadily, like an idea not yet voiced. The poison, he said, more to the air than to me, was exotic, rare, not something one acquires casually. That detail narrows the field. Watson, only someone with access to rare materials, or a reason to possess them, could have prepared that trap. And yet, I replied, the paper was given by Miss Vellum, not one of the other guests. Could she have poisoned it unknowingly? Holmes paused. Possible, but unlikely. Greeley asked her for it. She gave it willingly. That suggests intent, but whose? He sank into his armchair and stared into the hearth. She told us he wanted the paper for something symbolic, that he was curious about its properties. But a man does not prepare his own murder. Watson, the act of folding the Swan may have been innocent, but the Swan itself, it was finished by someone else. You mean he never completed it? I asked. Holmes gave a curt nod. Precisely. According to the coroner, the toxin acts within minutes. If he absorbed it during folding, he would not have had time to complete such a delicate construction, which means someone found him dying, I said, following his thought, and finished the Swan, placing it on his chest, or found him dead, Holmes added, and chose to frame the death with a symbol. I sat back, unsettled. But why? That, Holmes said, is the inconsistency. The following morning, we resumed our investigation in the library, where Holmes requested access to the estate's guest registry and household inventories. Merrick provided both with his usual stony silence. Note this, Watson, Holmes said, leafing through the inventory. 3 missing items, 2 rolls of Japanese washi paper, 1 book on South American flora, and a silver letter opener. A book on flora, I asked. Could it mention the toxin? Holmes turned a page. It does. Venoms and verdure, a collector's guide to poisonous plants. Annotated. I blinked. Good Lord. He smiled faintly. Not exactly bedtime reading. He flipped through the guest book. Signatures here: Staunton, Petrov, Howarth, Greeley, Miss Vellum. He paused, finger resting on one name. Interesting. What is it? Lady Howarth, he said, signed in a different ink. A heavier hand. Not at all like the confident scrawl she displayed when giving her statement. Someone else signed for her. Perhaps, or she masked her hand. But more than that, there's an earlier entry. 3 weeks ago, her name again. Visiting alone. I leaned in. A private visit. Unrecorded elsewhere. If she met with Greeley or the Windermeres at that time, it was not discussed. Why conceal it? Holmes stood. We must speak to her again. Lady Howarth received us in the solarium, wrapped in a shawl, despite the growing warmth. She watched Holmes approach, as one might regard a physician bearing unwanted news. "Mr. Holmes," she said coolly, "come to accuse me." "Merely to clarify, Lady Howarth," he replied. "We noticed you visited Windermere several weeks before the house party. It was not mentioned previously." Her expression didn't waver, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly around her teacup. "I visit often," she said. "I've known the Windermeres for decades." "Was Mr. Greeley present during that visit?" "No," she said too quickly, then added, "At least, not to my knowledge." Holmes tilted his head. "May I ask where you were educated?" She blinked. "Cheltenham, and later Florence." "Why? Did you ever travel outside Europe?" "I spent a year in Brazil, during my husband's diplomatic appointment. That was long ago." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Would you recognize this?" He handed her a printed leaf from the poison reference book. Lady Howarth studied it, her expression unreadable. "I've seen that plant. In the wild. Nasty thing." "Indeed," Holmes said. "It produces the neurotoxin found in Mr. Greeley's bloodstream." She went still. "I hope you're not implying—" "I imply nothing," Holmes said gently. "But it is curious. You see, that very book was taken from the library, and this page was dug. It seems someone was doing research." Lady Howarth set down her teacup. "I don't care for insinuation, Mr. Holmes. I knew Mr. Greeley only as a guest. A dull man, if you ask me." Holmes offered her a polite nod. "That is all, Lady Howarth. Thank you." Back in the corridor, Holmes pulled me aside. "She's hiding something." "She admitted being in Brazil," I said. "She may have recognized the toxin." "She did," Holmes said. "And more, she reacted to the page, not with confusion, but with familiarity. She's seen that exact leaf before, perhaps in this very book. Yet she claimed she barely knew Greeley." "You think she was more involved?" "Perhaps, or perhaps she feared him." We returned to our rooms to find a note slid under the door. It was unsigned, folded in quarters, and smelled faintly of lavender. Holmes unfolded it and read aloud. The Swan was not the message. It was the reply. He stared at the note for a long moment, then smiled slowly, darkly. "A message," he whispered. "Then who, Watson, was it replying to?" Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The note disturbed Holmes not because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied. A crime that had, until now, seemed chillingly deliberate, methodical, even was suddenly recast as a part of some unseen dialogue. A swan as reply, not declaration. It meant the victim was not simply murdered. He had spoken, and someone had answered. Holmes kept the note folded in his palm as he stood by the window of our temporary quarters at Windermere. Rain had begun to fall in thin, veiling sheets, cloaking the garden paths in mist. He was uncharacteristically still, his gaze fixed beyond the glass. "You believe the killer is still here?" I said at last. "I believe," Holmes murmured, "that whoever left this note was not trying to taunt me, Watson. They were confessing. Or warning." He turned toward me, eyes sharp with thought. "The case has shifted." "In what way?" He held up the note. "This tells us two things. First, Greeley left a message before he died. Perhaps not in words, but in something he did or failed to do. Second, someone interpreted it, understood it, and replied in kind. That implies knowledge, intimacy, perhaps guilt." I frowned. "But how would Greeley leave such a message while dying of poison?" He said he likely didn't finish the Swan. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The message wasn't the Swan. That was placed as a reply. His message must lie elsewhere, somewhere we haven't yet looked." A knock came at the door. It was Merrick. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said stiffly, "but Lord Windermere requests your presence. There's been an incident." Holmes' face didn't change, but I saw a glint pass through his eyes. "What kind of incident?" "In the East Corridor," Merrick said. "The governess, Miss Vellum, was found unconscious outside the nursery door. A paper crane was placed beside her head. The scene was one of quiet dread. Miss Vellum lay upon a fainting couch in the morning room, pale but breathing steadily. A physician had been called, but Holmes waved the man away after a brief examination. "No poison," he said. "She was struck from behind, blunt force. A warning, not an attempt on her life." The crane rested on a linen napkin beside her. Unlike the Swan, it was simple, common, something a child might fold. Yet its wings had been dipped in water and streaked faintly with ash. "What does it mean?" I asked. Holmes examined the folds carefully. "It's hastily made, not her work. And see here, the paper is slightly torn at the base. The attacker was in a hurry." Lestrade arrived moments later, breathless and flustered. "Lord in heaven. Another assault." "A message," Holmes corrected, "but not from the same hand." This isn't refinement, it's threat. Someone wants her silent. Lestrade paced. Silent, about what? Holmes stood and addressed the room. Miss Vellum must have seen something, or perhaps heard something. She's the only member of the household who bridges to worlds the guests above stairs, and the staff below. She's observant, quiet. People forget she's there, and someone feared she'd remember too much. Lestrade looked genuinely unsettled. So we have a murderer, and now a would-be attacker. Are we dealing with one criminal, or two? Holmes didn't answer directly. Sometimes a single hand throws two stones. Other times, one is thrown to mask the other. As the physician began tending to Miss Vellum, Holmes and I stepped into the corridor. A servant was scrubbing the floor outside the nursery door, where a faint trail of blood had dried. She must have hit her head, the maid murmured. Right on the wainscot. Poor thing. Holmes inspected the area. There are two sets of prints in the dust, one pair small, hers, the other larger, but careful, heel and toe visible, expensive shoes, someone familiar with the estate. I studied the ground. What was she doing near the nursery? Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, she wasn't there for the child. Later that day, Miss Vellum regained consciousness. Holmes sat by her bedside, while I remained a respectful distance away. Her voice was faint but steady. I was returning a book, she said. The girl Louise likes folktales before bed. I always bring one from the library. Holmes asked, did you see anyone? She shook her head slightly. I felt someone behind me. I turned and nothing. Then a pain. Holmes placed the crane in her hands. Do you recognize this? She looked at it for a long time. No. It's clumsy, not folded with care. Who would wish to silence you, Miss Vellum? She looked toward the ceiling. Mr. Greeley spoke to me once, she said, privately, the night before he died. He said someone had sent him something from his past, a memory folded into paper. He looked frightened. Did he say who? No. Only that it was connected to a promise he had broken. Holmes leaned closer. Did he show you what he received? She hesitated. Yes, he had a paper swan, but it wasn't the same one from the conservatory. It was older, creased and stained. He said it had once been a letter. Holmes sat back, expression unreadable. Thank you, Miss Vellum. You've helped more than you know. Back in our quarters, Holmes moved with energy, rifling through papers and drawing diagrams on the back of old envelopes. What is it? I asked. We've missed something vital, he said. The swan placed on Greeley's chest was not the original. It was an answer to the first a message sent days earlier, disguised as a gift. That first swan, creased and stained, was the message. He kept it, feared it, and someone else knew it still existed. But where is it now? Holmes turned sharply. That, he said, is the next question. Because if we find the original swan, he tapped the table, we find the motive. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. We rose before dawn the following morning. The air outside our window cool and laced with fog that drifted like ghosts through the hedges of Windermere. Holmes, already fully dressed and wearing his long grey traveling coat, had slept little. I knew the signs: his face, pale but alert, eyes blazing with the cold fire of focus. Today, Watson, he said, as he packed his notebook and a small black case, we shall poke the wasp's nest just slightly. Another provocation. A test, he replied. The paper swan, the second crane. These were symbols, not of violence, but of private communication. Someone here understands that language, and I intend to speak it. We made our way quietly to the conservatory, where Holmes spent several minutes rearranging the scene. The original paper swan with blood on its beak, now kept under protective wrapping in Holmes' possession, had been replaced with a nearly identical duplicate, slightly altered, but carefully folded by Holmes himself. Observe, he said, handing me the fake swan. Notice the edges. I've trimmed one wing half an inch shorter, and here see the crimson paint at the beak. Not blood this time, but dried pigment. A subtle difference. If someone returns to the scene and believes this is the same swan, they will not react. But if they notice the change, they're our suspect. He smiled faintly. Indeed, the next few hours were filled with strategic idleness. Holmes insisted we remain visible, taking breakfast in the drawing room, consulting maps of London's train lines, and speaking loudly enough for others to overhear our speculations about the case. At one point, Lord Windermere approached and muttered, I hope you're not wasting time with these paper things. Scotland Yard seems convinced it was that foreign cousin of Greeley's, the Italian man. Enzo had an argument the night before. Violent temper, they say. Holmes merely nodded. Indeed, my lord, tempers are like wind, they may spill, but rarely with such delicacy. Windermere frowned, clearly baffled, and walked away. Do you believe Enzo had anything to do with it? I asked once we were alone. Holmes tapped a finger on the arm of his chair. No, his presence is too obvious, and anger does not fold swans. By midday, the trap had been baited. Holmes instructed Lestrade to conduct another round of interviews. Press each member of the household about the paper swan, he said. Ask if they ever saw Greeley folding paper. Plant the idea that he had a habit of leaving messages for others in origami. Lestrade arched an eyebrow. That's not true. It doesn't need to be, Holmes replied coolly. The lie is not for them. It's for the liar. Lestrade grumbled but complied. Meanwhile, Holmes and I retired to the long hallway that overlooked the conservatory through a row of tall windows. There, concealed behind the linen curtains, we waited. 2 hours passed. Footsteps came and went. A gardener, a footman, then nothing. But near the 3rd hour, Holmes tensed. A figure entered the conservatory, a woman, slim and well-dressed in muted green. She paused just inside the threshold, glancing around. Then she moved to the fountain, bending slightly to examine the swan. It was Miss Althea Valtha, widow. She stared at the swan for a long time. Then, with deliberate care, she reached out and touched it only briefly, but her fingers moved with the instinct of someone checking for texture. Wait. Familiarity. Holmes watched unmoving. After a moment, she stepped back, clearly disturbed, and left. That, Holmes said, as we descended the stairs, was no casual inspection. She noticed the difference, and she didn't speak of it. No, which suggests she has something to hide. She recognized that this swan was not the original, and that is the first honest emotion she's shown. But what does it mean? I asked. Holmes' gaze darkened. It means she knew the original, possibly folded it, possibly received it. Either way, it was not an unfamiliar symbol to her. We returned to the guest wing and found Miss Vale seated alone in the reading room, a half-finished embroidery hoop in her lap. She looked up as we entered. Miss Vale, Holmes said smoothly, might we have a word? It concerns Mr. Greeley's more artistic tendencies. Her lips thinned slightly. I told the inspector, I know nothing of those strange paper birds. Holmes smiled faintly. That is not quite what I asked. She hesitated. You mean, was he an artist? Not in the traditional sense. Did he ever send you letters? Notes, perhaps. Folded messages. Miss Vale looked down at her embroidery. We were not close. Holmes folded his arms. I've always found it strange that grief wears a different face in every person. For some, tears. For others, silence. But rarely indifference. I am not indifferent, she said sharply. No, Holmes replied, stepping closer. Then why is it that you failed to mention the paper swan you found in your dressing table drawer this morning? The one you burned in the fireplace before breakfast. She stood up at once, face draining of color. I didn't. How could you know that? Holmes removed a small scrap of scorched paper from his pocket. I retrieved this from the ash, before your maid disposed of it. The tail was intact, creased precisely like the one left beside Greeley's body. But unlike that one, this bore the faint impression of writing. A name, perhaps. She turned away, gripping the back of the chair. I didn't kill him, she whispered. Then help me understand what message you received. Holmes said gently, after a long moment. She spoke. It was a name, she said, not mine. A woman's name, written in block letters, folded into the swan. Whose name? Holmes asked. Miss Vale didn't answer. Later, Holmes sat with me in the library, hands steepled beneath his chin. Her silence tells us more than any answer, he said. The name frightened her. It is a connection to Greeley's past, perhaps an affair, or an old secret he kept buried. Someone is resurrecting it now, and they're using origami as their cipher. I shook my head. But why now? That, Holmes murmured, is what we must discover. We are not solving a murder alone, Watson. We are decoding a conversation, one begun long ago, one that someone intends to finish. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. It was just past midnight when the house was stirred again. The creak of a distant floorboard snapped me awake. In the stillness of the Windmere estate, every sound felt amplified. The wind brushing past the ivy-covered windows, the faint ticking of a hall clock, and now, the urgent thud of footsteps moving quickly down the eastern corridor. Moments later, a frantic knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Inspector Lestrade in his dressing robe, face flushed and hair sticking damply to his brow. There's been another incident, he said without preamble. In the West Wing, one of the maids. Come quickly. Holmes appeared behind me almost immediately, already dressed, as if he had anticipated such a disturbance. Without a word, he slipped past us and led the way, his lantern casting long, distorted shadows upon the walls. We reached the servants' quarters. where a small crowd had already gathered in the narrow hall. Miss Althea Vale stood at its edge, pale and trembling, while Lady Windermere clutched her own dressing gown, lips tight with shock. In the far room, we found the maid, a girl named Esther, slumped beside her bed, still breathing, but clearly dazed. A brass candlestick lay near her head, blood smeared across its edge. Her eyes fluttered, trying to focus, her lips moving in silent panic. "She's alive," Holmes said, after kneeling beside her. "Barely." The blow was swift, meant to silence rather than kill. "Was it an intruder?" I asked. Lestrade looked grim. "No signs of forced entry, but someone went to great lengths to avoid being seen. There's an open servants' passage at the back. It leads toward the stables." Holmes stood slowly, then turned toward the rest of the room. The girl's modest belongings were scattered across the floor drawers, half pulled from the chest. A tin box of letters flung open. Someone had clearly been searching for something. But Holmes' attention snapped to a small desk beneath the window. Upon its surface, a single object sat, left behind with almost ceremonial care. Another paper swan, its beak painted black. We gathered again in the drawing room, where Holmes examined the swan beneath the glow of the oil lamps. This one was smaller than the previous folds, its wings more delicately shaped, almost hurried, as if made under pressure. Inside, tucked in the folds of the tail, was a slip of paper. But, unlike the others, this bore no names, only a series of initials. E.L. Holmes tapped the paper with a finger. "This is not just a warning. It is a message deliberately vague. Whoever struck that girl knew she might survive. But they left the swan as a form of theater. An intimidation tactic, yes, but also something else. A redirection." I ventured. He nodded. "Precisely." Lestrade was less convinced. "Seems simple to me. Esther was blackmailing someone. The attacker came to get rid of evidence." "No," Holmes said, voice soft but firm. "Look at the timing. Look at the placement. This was not a panicked act. It was calculated, designed to be found, but not immediately. Only when someone came looking." Lady Windermere cleared her throat delicately. "She was just a maid, Mr. Holmes." "Are we suggesting she was involved in something greater?" Holmes turned to her, expression unreadable. "No one in a mystery is just anything, Lady Win. Maids can be messengers, footmen can be spies, and gentlemen can be liars." He returned his gaze to the swan, rotating it in his fingers. "Why change the beak to black?" I asked. "A symbol of silence," Holmes replied, "or mourning. It suggests this swan was never meant to speak. A contradiction in intent. The first swan revealed a truth. This one buries it." Later that night, Holmes requested access to the estate's old servant ledgers, which he and I reviewed in the library. The pages were yellowed and ink-blotted, but Holmes examined them with surgical focus. "E.L.," he muttered, flipping back a decade. "Could be a former maid, a visitor, or a—" He pointed to an entry from 11 years prior. "Eliza Langley, governess to Lady Windermere's daughter. Dismissed, 1891. "Langley," Holmes murmured. "We're dealing with something far older than any of the current relationships. A ghost from the past. Someone connected to Greeley, Vale, and now Esther. But what does Esther have to do with Eliza Langley? I believe she found something, perhaps a letter, perhaps an object hidden in one of Greeley's old trunks. She tried to piece it together, but someone got there firsthand, decided she knew too much, and Langley, dead, if I'm not mistaken. But her name or her memory is being used as leverage, a posthumous threat." We left the library just after 3 in the morning, and as we passed through the central hall, Holmes paused. He bent down and retrieved something from the marble floor, a single strand of red thread, caught between the tiles. Without a word, he slipped it into his pocket. "Did you see who else was up tonight?" he asked me quietly. I shook my head. "Only Lestrade." Holmes sighed. "There was one other. I heard the drawing room door close an hour ago. Someone pacing. Then the sound of a drawer opening, and nothing more. They were searching for something, or perhaps hiding it, and you didn't intervene. I needed to see what they would do next." Before returning to our rooms, Holmes stood at the foot of the grand staircase and looked upward, toward the darkened gallery of portraits above. His voice, when he spoke, was hushed and oddly distant. "We are now in the middle of the storm, Watson. The swans are no longer messages, they're weapons." And with that, we ascended the steps, each of us, wondering who, among the house's many shadows, would next attempt to silence the truth. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface by morning. The mood at Windermere Hall had turned decidedly grim. The attempted attack on the maid, Esther, had left an invisible wound across the house. Everyone moved more cautiously. with hushed voices and sideward glances, as if guilt itself had taken form and stalked the corridors. Holmes, having slept no more than an hour, was already at the breakfast table when I arrived. He was not eating, of course, but instead sketching lines on a note card beside his teacups, small intersecting loops, arrows, and initials. I recognized EL and GG among the markings. "Did she survive the night?" I asked as I took my seat. "She did," he replied. "Mild concussion. She's under watch in the east bedroom. No memory of the attack yet. And the paper Swan, still locked in my valise," Holmes said, "as are the others. They're no longer just clues, Watson. They're signatures, the work of someone who wants to be seen while pretending not to exist." Lady Windermere entered soon after, her usual composure intact, but more brittle than before. She barely acknowledged Holmes or myself as she poured herself a cup of tea. Holmes rose politely. "Forgive me, Lady Windermere, but I wonder if you might indulge a question, one of a delicate nature." She glanced up sharply. "If I can answer it, Mr. Holmes, I will. Did your daughter have a governess named Eliza Langley?" Lady Windermere stiffened. "Yes, for a brief period, many years ago. She was dismissed." "For what reason?" Her fingers tightened around the porcelain. "There were ... complications. She developed an attachment to my husband, an unhealthy one. I confronted him. He swore it was nothing. But soon after, I caught her reading letters in his study. I dismissed her immediately." "Did your daughter know?" "She was too young to understand, thank God." Holmes nodded slowly. "And what became of Miss Langley?" "I received news some years ago that she died in poverty. Consumption, I believe. She had no family, no one to speak for her." Holmes resumed his seat. "And yet she speaks now, through paper swans and the initials scrawled into hidden notes." Lady Windermere paled but said nothing. By midday, Holmes and I ventured into the nearby town of Harrow, having acquired from Lady Windermere an old address where Eliza Langley had once lodged. The street was modest, and the lodging house had since been turned into a bakery. But the landlady who greeted us remembered Langley vividly. "A peculiar one," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "Always scribbling in journals, never spoke much, kept to herself. She'd stare out the window for hours. Once told me she was waiting for a letter that never came." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A letter?" "Yes," said she wrote dozens, but none were answered. She died here, you know, in the upstairs room. Her only possessions were her clothes, a box of folded paper shapes, and a notebook filled with poetry." Holmes turned toward me, a flicker of triumph dancing across his face. "Paper shapes?" The woman nodded. "Cranes. Mostly. Swans. Some of them were painted red or black. We burned most of them after she passed. Thought it was all nonsense." "Do you recall where her things were sent?" Holmes asked. The woman frowned. "Nowhere. No kin. Some gentleman came a month later asking about her, though. Odd fellow, tall, limp in his left leg. He took her notebook and a few other items. Said he was settling her affairs." Holmes stiffened. "Did he give a name?" "No. But he had the look of a scholar, cold, like a man who studies people rather than feels for them." We returned to Windermere Hall under a brooding sky. The clouds had thickened, and the first spatters of rain struck the carriage windows as we arrived. Holmes was silent the entire journey, staring out into the shifting gray, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There is a thread here, Watson," he said at last, "and I believe it runs not merely through Windermere Hall, but across years of silence and shame. You suspect someone among the house's residents was connected to Langley, more intimately than Lady Windermere admitted." Holmes offered a slight nod. "Not just connected. Obsessed. Enough to keep her folded words alive." Long after her death, that evening, Holmes requested to speak again with Miss Althea Vale. She agreed, though somewhat reluctantly, and joined us in the library after dinner. She wore a soft green dress, and carried herself with a gentle, melancholy grace. "I must ask you something difficult," Holmes said, without preamble. "Did you ever hear the name Eliza Langley before yesterday?" She looked puzzled. "No. Should I have? She was governess to Lady Windermere's daughter when you were quite young, but I suspect your father knew her, perhaps more than he should have." Althea's expression darkened. "There were times I saw letters, old ones, hidden in his desk, but I was never allowed to read them. He said they were private wounds from a time long gone." "Did he ever mention a poet? Or a woman who folded paper birds?" Her brow furrowed. "Once, when I was a child, I asked why he kept swans on the lake. He said someone used to fold them for him. Someone who wanted to speak in silence." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recall where he kept these letters?" She hesitated. "There's a locked cabinet in the conservatory. I believe the key is still in his desk. Holmes stood. Then we have no time to waste. Together, we made our way to the conservatory. Holmes, Miss Vale, and myself. The key was indeed in the desk. And within minutes, Holmes had opened the mahogany cabinet. Inside was a small box. Holmes lifted it carefully and opened it. A collection of yellowed papers, some handwritten letters, dated and signed with the initials E.L., a few poems, and beneath them, swans. 15 of them, each folded with precision, stained with age, and some painted in red or black dot. Holmes picked one up, unfolded it slowly. Written inside, in delicate ink, "I am still watching from the lake, my love. I am still folded where you left me." Holmes let out a breath. She never stopped writing, even after her dismissal, even in death. And someone never stopped reading, I murmured. He nodded grimly. And now, someone is finishing what Eliza Langley began, or thought she began. He turned toward Althea Vale. The past has not been buried, Miss Vale. It has been folded, precisely, and left to drift into the present. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' grand strategy. Following morning broke with an eerie stillness across Windmere Hall. The storm from the night before had passed, but the air remained heaviest, though the very atmosphere braced itself for a final revelation. Holmes, unusually brisk and focused, summoned Lady Windmere, Althea Vale, Mr. Grayson Vale, and Inspector Lestrade into the drawing-room. He instructed Mrs. Ellery, the housekeeper, to ensure the staff remained on the ground floor, and that no one was to be allowed near the library without his express permission. It was clear to me that Holmes was setting the board for his final move. "Watson," he said, as we stood alone in the conservatory once more, "we are entering the most delicate phase of this investigation. One false step, and the culprit may vanish like smoke. You've finally identified them." He tapped the box of paper swans gently. "I have identified a shadow, Watson, one that has flitted across the mirrors of this case, never leaving a clear reflection. But shadows, too, have weight if one knows where to press." He motioned toward the writing desk. "We will place the box of swans back here, in full view. It will be discovered. It must be. And then we observe who cannot resist revisiting the past." That afternoon, Holmes requested that Lady Windmere host a small gathering in the parlor under the pretense of discussing the estate's future. It was an unusual request, and she seemed uneasy about it, but Holmes assured her it would help resolve the affair. Guests included all remaining household members: Mr. Grayson Vale, Miss Althea, Mr. Eddington, the groundskeeper, Mrs. Ellery, and of course Lestrade and myself. As conversation carried on, I noticed Holmes excused himself quietly. I followed several minutes later and found him hidden behind the arched glass of the conservatory, crouched behind the heavy ivy. His eyes met mine, and he raised a single finger to his lips. He was waiting for a fish to take the bait. The hour dragged slowly through a narrow sliver between the curtains. Holmes watched the library door, and then it moved. A figure, cloaked in shadow, crept silently through the hallway, not toward the parlor, toward the library. Holmes tensed. I felt it through the air itself, like the taut wire of a snare. The figure reached the desk, hesitated, and opened the lid of the small wooden box. Holmes rose in a flash, gliding like a hunting cat across the corridor. I followed a breath behind him. The intruder turned at the creak of the floorboard, eyes wide, caught mid-act. It was Grayson Vale. But it was not fear in his eyes, it was anger. "You had no right," he growled, pushing the lid shut. "None of this belongs to you." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, voice calm and crisp, "these remnants are the only truth we have left, and they've pointed to you." Grayson's jaw tightened. "I only came to remove them, for Althea's sake. She already knows," Holmes said softly, "and she deserves more than shadows and silence." I stepped forward. "You were the one who retrieved Eliza Langley's things after her death, weren't you? You were the man the landlady described." Grayson didn't deny it. "She loved my father, and he ruined her. My mother protected his name and cast Eliza aside like a fallen leaf. I was just a boy, but I remembered her. I remembered her kindness, the stories she told. She was the only one who saw me when everyone else looked through me. And so you preserved her voice," Holmes said, motioning to the swans, "and began using it to speak in her place." Grayson's eyes filled with tears, but they burned rather than fell. "I thought I could frighten them, shake the ghosts loose. But it wasn't enough." "You escalated," Holmes murmured. "From notes and folded warnings to real threats, to violence. I never meant to hurt anyone," he whispered. "I didn't even touch the girl. I only meant to scare her, send a message." "A message to whom?" Holmes asked quietly. Grayson's lips trembled. "To the house. To the blood that runs through its walls. I thought if they feared her name again, they would understand what they had done. And the blood on the swan's beak, his silence told us everything. Holmes motioned to me, and I stepped forward to gently retrieve the box. There will be a formal statement, Mr. Vale, Holmes said evenly. But for now, I suggest you remain where you are. Grayson gave a slow, sad nod. Do what you must. I have nothing left to protect. As we returned to the parlor with the evidence in hand, Holmes said nothing more. He had baited the trap and drawn the past into the light not through force, but through irresistible memory. The Swans had not merely carried Eliza Langley's sorrow, they had carried the guilt of a house that tried to bury what it could not silence. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The house remained oddly silent that evening, though we were now certain at least one ghost had been unmasked. Grayson Vale was confined to his chambers under Lestrade's guarded watch, though the inspector himself still grumbled that the evidence was circumstantial. Holmes, for his part, seemed neither triumphant nor relaxed. On the contrary, I had never seen him so quietly pensive. He sat cross-legged by the hearth in the drawing-room, the orange firelight flickering across his sharp features, his fingers steepled before him, brows knitted in a kind of inward fury. "You believe Grayson Vale is not the end of it," I said finally, breaking the long silence. Holmes didn't answer at first. His eyes remained fixed on the paper swan resting on the edge of the mantel its beak, still stained with a spot of dried crimson, now more artifact than threat. "No," he said at last, "he is not. But he admitted guilt. But guilt is a complicated animal, Watson. Some confess out of remorse, others out of misplaced loyalty, and some," he leaned forward, his voice sharpening, "confess to a lesser crime to protect someone else entirely." I felt a chill despite the fire. "You suspect he's shielding someone?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes. I believe he sought to frighten someone into confession. When that failed, he took bolder action. But the original voice in this game, the one who first folded a swan and painted its beak with blood, is not him." He rose then, walking to the writing desk once more. He opened the box carefully, examining the arrangement within. "Notice this one," he said, drawing out a particularly delicate swan from the bottom. "Thinner paper, the folds are finer, and this crisp look at the edge here, it's done by a right-handed person using the thumb in a particular habit of smoothing creases. It's unique. And the others, cruder, bulkier, likely imitated." He replaced the swan and turned toward me, the familiar glint of revelation beginning to gleam in his eyes. "We've been treating the box as a monolith, assuming it was one mind, one hand behind its creation. But it's not," Grayson added to it. "But someone else began it. And who do you think that someone is?" Holmes said nothing. Instead, he crossed to the glass cabinet, where Lady Windermere had displayed Eliza Langley's remaining possessions. He drew out the faded diary. Gently, reverently, he opened to the final pages. "She wrote in riddles," he murmured. "Code, even in her most personal thoughts." He showed me a page where a passage had been underlined. "The paper bird sings with red on its beak. It flies into hands that once held me with kindness, now turned cold." Holmes turned the diary around, revealing a faint indent beneath the ink, written over another line, which she tried to hide. Here he took a small graphite pencil and gently shaded across the indent, revealing the ghost of hidden writing beneath. "She knows. She saw the letters. I fear her more than the house itself." Holmes whispered the words aloud. "She, not Grayson." I felt my breath catch. "Althea?" I asked. Holmes did not answer directly. He stood walking once again to the library window and staring out toward the moors. The first swan appeared the same week. The estate solicitor reported odd inquiries into the inheritance, and the only one with unrestricted access to the library and Grayson's possessions was Althea. I breathed. Holmes nodded. She knew of her mother's shame. She resented the silence, the exile, the whispers of her illegitimacy. I believe she found Eliza's letters long before Grayson did, and it lit a fuse in her mind, a slow burn. At first, perhaps, only poetry, a dark little joke. But rage is a patient seed, Watson. He turned toward me. She wanted to punish them, not with violence, but with fear, a reckoning. But then Grayson took it further. And now, Holmes said, "I believe she fears her secret will come to light, and she may act again, not to hurt, but to bury what might still emerge." I was silent, overwhelmed by the sheer psychological complexity of it. "She's brilliant," I said quietly. And Broken Holmes gave a soft, sad smile. "As many are, but brilliance left to fester becomes something else entirely." That night, Holmes requested that Lady Windermere and the remaining household assemble once more the next morning in the drawing-room. It was clear that the final act was coming, and Holmes, as ever, would be its conductor. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape the moor was cloaked in a grey, choking fog by morning. It hung low and clung to the house like damp silk, muting the usual morning clatter of the estate. I awoke to a knock at my door. Holmes stood there, already dressed, his coat drawn tightly around him. "She tried to run today," he said matter-of-factly. "She's frightened. The threads are tightening. She knows Grayson's confession was incomplete, and that I've seen through it." I followed Holmes downstairs, the chill of the hallway creeping into my bones despite the heavy stone hearths. Lestrade was in the drawing-room, sipping from a chipped cup of tea with all the cheer of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "She's still in her room?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Lestrade replied. "Refused breakfast. Hasn't come out since you sent word to gather the family." Holmes nodded. "Then it begins now." He turned to me and lowered his voice. "I planted something in the library last night. A simple decoy, but it will draw her." I raised a brow. A note, phrased like a message from Elisa Langley, written in her hand. "You forged her handwriting. An elementary exercise, Watson." At that very moment, a loud creak echoed from upstairs, followed by hurried footsteps. Holmes held up a hand for silence. We listened. The footsteps did not go toward the drawing-room or dining hall. They moved toward the western hall, down the corridor leading to the library end. Then, a pause. The faint sound of a latch, a door opening. "She's taken the bait," Holmes said. We slipped from the drawing-room, Holmes leading the way, with fluid silence. He bypassed the main corridor and took the servants' stairwell instead, descending lightly to the rear hall. We arrived at the library door, just in time to see Althea Windermere inside, bent over the writing desk. Her gloved hand trembled as she held a piece of folded parchment, Holmes's forged note. Her face was pale as bone, and in the dim morning light, her features looked almost spectral. Holmes stepped into the room quietly. "Miss Windermere," he said, his tone gentle. Althea spun around, startled, her fingers tightening around the paper. She stammered. "I was only reading a ghost's confession," Holmes offered. She swallowed. "It isn't real," she said. "This isn't her handwriting." "Ah, but you knew that before you opened it," Holmes replied. "And yet you came to read it." She turned away from him, her body shaking with restrained emotion. "I never meant harm," she said at last. "I only wanted him to admit it. What he did to her, how he discarded her like some dirty secret. You believed the world would never know, unless you forced it into the light," Holmes said. Althea nodded. "He lied to all of us. To Mother. To me. But Sheila's was never just a servant. She was our blood. My blood. I found her letters when I was 17, and everything I thought I knew crumbled." She clenched the Swan in her hand. "I wanted to shame him. The Swans were warnings, riddles, a game, but one with purpose. But Grayson raised the stakes." Holmes said softly. "Yes. When he found out what I'd done, he didn't even scold me. He told me he understood. That Eliza's memory haunted him, too. I thought we had made peace with it. Until he poisoned Lady Windermere," I said quietly. Althea looked up, her eyes wide. "No, he didn't." There was silence. Holmes tilted his head. "I beg your pardon." Althea looked between us, confused and shaken. "He threatened to, said he would do anything to keep the estate, the name, intact. But he never went through with it. The brandy, I replaced it. I dumped it down the drain and poured a fresh bottle from the study. I couldn't let him." Her voice faltered. The silence deepened. Holmes turned away from her slowly, staring into the fire. "Then the poisoning," he murmured, mostly to himself. "If not Grayson." He looked at me, then at the diary, then back at Althea. "There's a third player," he said. A knock echoed from the main hallway. Lestrade stepped in, pale-faced. "She's gone," he said. "Lady Windermere's vanished from her room." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in the final clue. Revealed the news, struck like a thunderclap. "Gone," Holmes repeated. "Lady Windermere is gone." Lestrade nodded grimly. "The bedclothes are undisturbed. The window latch was opened too wide for a woman in her condition to slip through, but her slippers are missing. So is her shawl." Holmes remained motionless for a heartbeat, then turned to Althea. His tone clipped. "You said you switched the poisoned brandy. Was that before or after last night's dinner?" She looked stunned. "Before. Hours before. I had made sure it was clean." "And the tea?" he asked. "Was your mother's evening tea ever in your care?" "No," she said. "Mrs. Pinner prepares it every night." Holmes turned to Lestrade with sudden urgency. "We need to find the housekeeper, Now. We hurried down the corridor, the fog curling against the stained glass windows like specters. The housekeeper's quarters were near the kitchen, a simple space with a single bed, writing desk, and wardrobe. But when we arrived, the room was empty and the wardrobe flung open. Her black uniform was gone. Holmes scanned the room in seconds. He stepped to the desk and opened the top drawer. Ah! He lifted a torn envelope, its wax seal barely clinging. Inside was a small pressed paper swan like the others, delicate, folded from a music sheet. Its beak was stained with something brown and dry. More blood? I asked. No, Holmes said. This is dried tea. Poisoned tea. There was silence as the implication settled in. Then Holmes spoke, his voice cool and precise. Mrs. Pinner has been playing a longer game than any of us suspected. She must have intercepted the true swan meant for Lady Windermere replanted. Her own as a message. Then she's the one who poisoned her. I asked. Indeed. And not only Lady Windermere. I believe she attempted to frame Althea and Grayson both, at separate turns allowing each to unravel under the weight of their secrets. Clever, Watson. Devilishly clever. Lestrade paled. But why? What could the housekeeper possibly gain? Holmes turned to him. What any long-suffering servant might desire after a lifetime of resentment. Justice, retribution, or inheritance. I echoed. Holmes held up the paper swan. I believe Mrs. Pinner was Eliza Langley's sister. We stood frozen. She knew what happened. Holmes continued. Perhaps Eliza confided in her before she died. Perhaps she found the child's letters years later. Althea may not have been the only one rummaging through trunks. But the motive isn't just blood. It's betrayal. She stayed in this house and watched its walls absorb the memory of a discarded girl, denied her name and future. And when Grayson refused to speak of it, when Lady Windermere treated Eliza's existence as an embarrassment to be buried, Mrs. Pinner decided to act. She poisoned the old woman out of vengeance. Lestrade said, vengeance and to ignite a fire under this crumbling estate. Holmes added, each paper swan was a fuse, one for Grayson, one for Althea, but the real target was always the family itself. A servant burst into the room. Sir, Mr. Holmes, there's been shouting in the garden. We rushed to the rear entrance and followed the sound of voices. The fog had lifted just enough to see shadowy shapes moving through the hedges, and there, at the base of the rose archway, stood Lady Windermere, her grey hair loosed about her shoulders. Mrs. Pinner stood facing her, clutching something in her hand. Holmes stopped us with a raised palm. Let it play. Out a moment longer, he whispered. From the fog came the unmistakable voice of Lady Windermere, thinned by age but defiant. You were her sister. That's what this is all about. I was her sister, Mrs. Pinner snapped. And you left her to rot. You let your son seduce her, ruin her, then cast her out like a maid who'd broken the china. She made her choices. She had no choices. The housekeeper shouted. You made certain of that. Holmes stepped forward now, voice sharp. That's enough. Mrs. Pinner turned, startled, and Holmes held up the dried swan. A beautiful design, he said, but ultimately a dead end. Mrs. Pinner's hand faltered. I caught the glint of metal. She was holding a slender blade, a pruning knife, but her strength had abandoned her. With a heavy breath, she dropped it, the blade vanishing into the grass like a fallen petal. Lestrade moved forward with his men, and Holmes placed a steadying hand on Lady Windermere's arm. Justice will be served, he said quietly, but not in blood. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing room of Windermere Hall had been transformed into a theatre of tension. The once grand chamber, with its faded crimson drapes and the scent of cold hearth ash, now held the key players of this grim performance, seated as if in silent judgment of one another. Holmes had insisted upon their presence, and none dared defy his will. Not after the garden scene that morning. Lady Windermere, frail but composed, sat upright in her backed chair, like a porcelain relic of another age. Althea stood behind her, pale but resolute. Grayson loomed at the mantelpiece, arms crossed, his expression guarded, and near the windows, Lestrade kept watch over Mrs. Pinner, who sat quietly with her hands folded, a faint, almost satisfied smile playing on her lips. Holmes paced slowly between them, his fingers laced behind his back, his movements as deliberate as a judge preparing to read a verdict. I have gathered you here, he began, not for spectacle, but for clarity. The threads of this case are tangled in history, resentment, and silence, but the truth, as always, unravels under the weight of its own inevitability. He turned to Mrs. Pinner. You may not speak again today, madam. Your actions have already cried loud enough. She said nothing, merely lifted her chin in defiance. Holmes shifted his gaze to Grayson. Mr. Windermere, you knew Eliza Langley. You knew her well. Grayson's jaw tensed. Yes, he said quietly. I loved her. You courted her under false promises, then abandoned her when scandal threatened your inheritance. No, his voice cracked like a whip. I wanted to marry her, but my father, he threatened to disown me, to throw her into the street. I was a coward. I let her go. It was the greatest regret of my life. Holmes nodded gravely. She was with child when she left. Grayson's face paled. I didn't know. I swear it. She sent letters. At least one of them reached your mother. Holmes now faced Lady Windermere, whose eyes had begun to glisten. I destroyed it, she admitted after a pause. I was trying to protect the family, our name, our standing. I didn't imagine she would die. You imagined she would vanish. Holmes corrected. But Eliza Langley did not vanish. She left behind a daughter, a child raised under a false name, with only fragments of her mother's past. That child grew up here. A silence swept the room. Althea's breath caught audibly. I'm sorry, she whispered. Holmes turned to her, voice gentler now. You are not the daughter of servants, Miss Althea. You are the daughter of Eliza Langley. She returned to Windermere Hall not long after your birth, sick, frightened, and with nowhere else to go. But she was refused. Your adoptive parents took her in as a kindness. When she died, they kept you. They were never allowed to speak the truth. Althea sat heavily into a nearby chair, a hand to her mouth. Her eyes searched the room, then fell upon Grayson. He stood frozen, horror dawning across his face. I have a daughter, he breathed. No, Althea said coldly. Standing again. You had a daughter. A man who lets a woman rot in a London alley, after promising her the world forfeits the right to fatherhood. The words hung in the air like frost. Holmes stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. The paper swans were no riddle, no taunt. They were memorials. Each one folded from the sheet music Eliza played as a girl, left like breadcrumbs. A trail back to truth. Mrs. Pinner used them both as tribute, and as weapons each, meant to sting. To force the guilty to remember. Lestrade cleared his throat. And the poison, that was never meant to kill, was it? Holmes nodded. Mrs. Pinner dosed Lady Windermere, just enough to frighten her, enough to bring the past out of its grave. The true victim here was Eliza. The silence that followed was unbroken by defense or protest. Even Lady Windermere bowed her head. Perhaps for the first time in decades, Holmes gave a final glance around the room. There is more to be said, but not here. Scotland Yard will handle what remains. He turned to me and offered a slight nod. Come, Watson. I believe our time at Windermere Hall is concluded. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks. Down the crime we had scarcely left the drawing room, when Holmes motioned me into the study, where the morning light filtered through tall, dust-streaked windows. His steps slowed, and he moved to the fireplace. Where the remnants of old ash whispered the memory of warmth. He lit his pipe with uncharacteristic silence, the flame catching with a hiss. Only when the tobacco had taken properly did he speak. Watson, he murmured, the human soul is a more tangled web than any crime. I waited, notebook at the ready. You see, he continued, Mrs. Pinner did not kill anyone, not directly. Her methods were cruel, theatrical, even manipulative, but not fatal. The poison administered to Lady Windermere was carefully dosed, just enough to induce confusion and weakness, not death. She wished to awaken ghosts, not create new ones. But the blood on the paper swan, I asked, that was real. Holmes nodded. It was her own, a shallow, cut symbolic, calculated. She knew Lady Windermere would recognize the swan's meaning, and believe a phantom from the past had returned to haunt her. Each paper bird was a silent shriek, folded in vengeance. And yet, also sorrow. He exhaled, the smoke curling up like a wisp of thought. Eliza Langley, Holmes said softly, was betrayed not just by a man, but by a system. She was dismissed, denied, and forgotten. Mrs. Pinner, who had known her as a girl, never forgave this household for what it did. So she plotted not for justice, but exposure. She wanted the truth in the open, to see them all squirm under the weight of their buried sins. And the attempt on Grayson's life, I asked, the knife near the lake. Ah, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. That was the one moment when the game threatened to become something else. He walked to the bookcase and removed a slim leather-bound volume of poetry. From within it, he retrieved a folded note, the same one Althea had found in her chamber. This was not Mrs. Pinner's doing. It was Grayson's own guilt. He fabricated the attack to shift suspicion, to make himself a victim. A desperate gambit by a man who sensed the walls closing in. A coward's performance, like his abandonment of Eliza. I blinked. Then why didn't you expose him immediately? Holmes' smile was faint, almost melancholic. Because it wasn't time. A case, like a play, must allow its actors to reach their lines. He paused, tapping the pipe stem against his palm. There was another player in this, someone whose silence bore the most weight. Althea. I sat up. You believe she knew? Not entirely, but the pieces had begun to fall into place for her. The music sheets folded into Swanstows weren't random pages. They were Eliza's favorite compositions, known only to someone close to her. Althea, growing up among them, would have recognized their patterns. She didn't react with shock when I revealed her parentage, Holmes continued. She reacted with fury, which means, at some level, she'd suspected all along. Mrs. Pinner's theatrics were not only meant to torment the Windmeres, they were also a breadcrumb trail for the girl to follow. I frowned. And now that she knows, that, Holmes said quietly, is not our mystery to solve. A knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, frowning. We've taken Mrs. Pinner. No resistance, though I dare say, she looks almost satisfied she would, Holmes replied. The confession she sought has already been made in expressions, silences, and tears. Let the law handle the formalities. Lestrade nodded and departed. Holmes turned back to the hearth, the flames now dancing steadily. He stood silent for a moment, then said, There are crimes that require chains and bars, Watson, and others that live only in memory, punished by the years stolen and the truths withheld. In the end, Eliza Langley's justice came not from a courtroom, but from the unraveling of lies that kept her voiceless. As the day slipped further into gray, I found myself unable to speak for some time. There was no triumphant cry, no flourish of victory, only the quiet certainty that Holmes had, once again, seen what others could not. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere within the house, a paper swan sat forgotten on a windowsill, its beak still red, its wings folded in eternal silence. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Mrs. Pinner's arrest, while calm and without protest, sent a ripple through the estate like a chill through warm tea. The servants kept their eyes lowered, their steps hushed. It was as though the house itself, once bloated with secrets, had exhaled at last. Lady Windermere refused to see anyone for 2 days. I had expected tears from her, or perhaps rage. But when Holmes and I were finally summoned to her chamber, we found her seated upright in a high-backed chair by the fire, hands folded in her lap like those of a woman, awaiting a verdict already known. My doctor says it was belladonna, she said without preamble. Enough to confuse the heart, fog the mind. She knew precisely how much to administer. Holmes inclined his head. Mrs. Pinner was meticulous. I suppose I should be grateful she didn't wish me dead. There are cruelties more enduring than death, Holmes said gently. She flinched at that, ever so slightly. Do you believe she hated me, Mr. Holmes? I believe she pitied Eliza Langley, he replied, and that her grief took the shape of vengeance. Lady Windermere's lips tightened. She was a housemaid. She was a human being, Holmes said sharply, and the room stilled. Who trusted your husband, and was discarded like the Daily Post. To my surprise, Lady Windermere did not argue. She only turned her face toward the fire and said, almost absently, I think I always knew. There were moments, a silence in the nursery, a shadow in his voice, when I asked after the girl. Then why bury it? I asked, why go on, as if, because truth is rarely convenient, she murmured. And because I loved my husband, even when he did not deserve it. Holmes did not speak. He simply looked at her with those hawk-like eyes of his, sharp, but not cruel, and gave the smallest of bows. Then we left her to her fire and her ghosts. Inspector Lestrade, as expected, was more than eager to file his report to Scotland Yard, taking care to underline the swift and precise intervention of the Metropolitan Police. He even went so far as to describe Holmes as an enthusiastic consultant, which made my friend chuckle over his morning toast. Let him have it, Holmes said. The man does try. But the motive, I pressed. Will Mrs. Pinner be charged with attempted murder? Holmes shook his head. The dosage was too low, the intent calculated. It will be psychological manipulation at best, perhaps fraud. And given her age, and her spotless history, she may very well be spared prison altogether. I asked. Holmes grew quiet. She has inherited more than a name, Watson. She's inherited silence. Whether she breaks it or not, it's her own decision. We took our leave of Windmere Hall that same afternoon. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the scent of old rain and wet earth. As our carriage rattled down the winding drive, I turned for one last glimpse of the manor's tall windows and curling chimneys. It loomed behind us majestic, secretive, and suddenly frail. Leaning back with his hat tilted low, said softly, "What we solved was never really about a crime." I looked at him. "It was about grief," he continued, "and how some people folded into birds, others into silence, and a few into something far sharper." Outside, a breeze stirred the trees, and I thought again of the swan on the windowsill, still watching, waiting. Chapter 18. Holmes. Final reflection. It was some days later, back in Baker Street. Then I found Holmes in an unusually reflective mood. He stood by the window, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the bustling street below, but seeing nothing of it. The fire crackled behind him, casting golden light across the sitting room. Our latest case lay in the past, yet its weight lingered in the air between us. I broke the silence. "She recovered, I believe. Lady Windermere, I mean, in time." Holmes didn't turn. "Recovery is a fiction, Watson. People do not recover from wounds such as hers. They adapt. They hide. But recovery and all, that is reserved for the innocent." He stepped away from the window and poured himself a measure of tea. He took no sugar, no milk, just the bitterness, unsoftened. I leaned forward in my chair, clasping my hands. "Holmes, one thing still troubles me. That paper Swan. How did you know it was the key?" He smiled faintly. "You recall the first time I saw it? In the study, on the windowsill." "Precisely. A strange place for a child's toy, wouldn't you say? Especially one so delicate. The inked beak, the red stain too deliberate to be accidental. And when Lady Windermere claimed it was her daughter's, I noticed the child never once looked for it, nor cared when it vanished. A child forgets easily, yes, but not that which they love." I nodded. "Then it was meant to be found." "Indeed, Mrs. Pinner used it as a message, Watson, a confession in disguise." The swan was Eliza Langley's symbol. She folded them constantly, according to the nursemaids. One had been kept hidden for years, and finally placed in plain sight. It was the beginning and the end of the crime, the origin of the sorrow, and the emblem of justice. But why act now? After all these years? Holmes sat down, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Because the child turned 13, the very age Eliza had reached when she last served in Windermere Hall. An age when girls begin to understand what men mean when they say too little and do too much. Mrs. Pinner feared history would repeat itself, or, perhaps, more truthfully, she could no longer live with having buried the first one. Silence fell between us, thick and unyielding. After a moment, I asked, "Do you believe Lady Windermere truly knew about her husband's misdeeds?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "She knew enough to avoid the truth. That is often worse than ignorance." Outside, the city rolled on, horses clattered, vendors barked, and life resumed its endless theater. But here, in our lodgings, a subtle stillness took hold. Holmes rose again, walked to the mantel, and picked up a small object I hadn't noticed before. Another paper Swan. It was folded with exquisite care. Its beak touched lightly with red ink. "Mrs. Pinner left it behind," he said quietly. "A final act. Not of defiance, I think, but of peace." He placed it down gently beside the tobacco jar. A symbol that would now live among his many curiosities, next to the Persian slipper and the bullet-ridden wall. Then he turned toward me, with that familiar, detached calm returning to his features. "You see, Watson, there are crimes born not of greed or revenge, but of mourning. Crimes committed not to destroy, but to remember. And those are the most difficult of all. To solve because they ask not how, but why." I rose, brushing the ash from my lapels. "You made it look elementary." He offered the faintest smile. "Because it always is once you've seen the shape of the sorrow." We stood there a moment, men suspended between tragedy and logic, between justice and something far more. Then Holmes turned back to the window, lighting his pipe with a match struck on the heel of his boot. "I think," he said, "I shall take no cases for a fortnight. That bad? No, just a rare taste for silence." And with that, he said no more.